We talked about in the last class Weber's idea that a state is that entity which claims the use or successfully claims legitimate violence within a territory. In some ways, although Mbembe does not cite Weber here, Mbembe is mostly talking about Foucault and biopower. There might be something similar to what Mbembe is saying about the idea of necropolitics and the role of the state or sovereignty. So he says here is my concern is those figures of sovereignty whose central project is not the struggle for autonomy. So that's what we usually think about sovereignty, right? The struggle for autonomy. When we're trying to be an independent, we're trying to have sovereignty, we're trying to have independence or autonomy. But he says it's not his concern, but the generalized instrumentalization of human existence and the material destruction of human bodies and populations. Oh, that sounds fun. So, differently put, I like that quote, but I like what he said at the very beginning better. Sometimes, and if an author is really good, they'll put their main point at the very beginning. This is really good as a starter line. This essay assumes that the ultimate expression of sovereignty resides, to a large degree, in the power and the capacity to dictate who may live and who must die. That's a powerful opener, you have to say. And it's good on him, Mbembe, for opening up that way. If you got a line like this, you don't want to save it to the end of your paper. You want to put it right at the beginning. If I got a paper like this, I'd just stop right there. I'd probably just give it an A right there. I wouldn't even have to read anymore. Just look at that quote all day. The power to dictate who may live and who must die. Wow. So that's pretty hardcore. I think that Weber and Foucault are talking more about what Foucault calls biopower, this idea of the bureaucracy and administration of the state, whereas Mbembe is really talking about that there's certain people in the state apparatus have this sovereignty or this power to basically decide who lives and who dies. And he's concerned mostly about who dies here. Now, the big idea here, though, is that what Mbembe is talking about is that a lot of these kinds of practices, the decisions of who should live and who should die, the control over certain kinds of populations, were first tested out in the colonies. And by the colonies, we basically mean the Americas, later on in Africa. Crucial to this concatenation is once again race. In fact, in most instances, the selection of races, the prohibition of mixed marriages, forced sterilization, even the extermination of vanquished peoples are to find their first testing ground in the colonial world. So again, in some ways, what Mbembe is doing here, unlike Weber and Foucault, is he's talking about how sovereignty and state power works, not just in the European and the later North American idealized context, but how this necropolitics, this terror combined with politics, was first tested out in the colonies. It was first perfected in the colonies. The power to decide who gets to live and who gets to die as the basis of sovereignty, and that this was then tested out in a whole system of colonial laws and regulations, basically in many ways during enslavement in the Americas, the prohibition of mixed marriages, right? Laws against who was able to marry whom. We supposedly don't have those anymore, but there's still a legacy of that for sure. When you want to declare a war on drugs, what are you trying to do? By saying, if I just say what we need to do is to have greater penalties for drug dealers and drug use, and we need to increase the treatment centers. That's one position, right? And then if I say, I'm on a war on drugs, what does that do? What am I trying to do if I say this is a war on drugs? All right. What is a war? What is a legitimate? Let me put it that way. World War II. Why was that a legitimate war? We say, I'm just saying this. I'm not saying it is. I'm just saying this is what we say it is, right? We say a legitimate war is one that is voted upon or declared, right? In fact, Congress is actually supposed to vote on a war. World War I and World War II were voted in. We have rarely had votes on wars. You could say that in that case, although I believe the war on Iraq was an illegitimate war, it did have congressional approval. People voted. And so, unlike some military actions, which never come up for a vote, right, it did go through and was approved by Congress to a certain extent. So it's usually one, there's some declaration or process by which it happens. And two, it's usually supposed to be against another place, another country, right? Another state. That's what it's saying in the first quote, is that a legitimate war is a war conducted by one state against another, or more precisely, a war between civilized states, right? And those are supposed to be legitimate because it's like, okay, well, they're fighting, but that's legitimate. When I say I'm gonna do a war on drugs, what am I trying to do with my actions? Or what am I trying to do with that phrase? Other than just say, I'm trying to eliminate drugs, I'm trying to curtail the use of drugs, or I'm trying to get drugs out of our schools. If I say I'm going to war on drugs, what am I doing? Who are you fighting when you're fighting the war on drugs, right? I'm fighting back against drugs. How? Like, it's one thing when someone attacks you and you're fighting back. How are you fighting back against drugs?
With drugs.
Yeah. What exactly? A fight is supposed to be between people. When you say it's a war on drugs, what does that do? It calls up these images of people going in and doing what they did in the war on drugs, which is go in and beat up people, right? It legitimizes a whole bunch of actions. And then you basically act like, oh, drugs are such a big deal that we can send the military in, right? Or the equivalent of the military to fight this. I would say, whenever anybody says they're doing a war on something, just watch out, because the kinds of things they're trying to legitimate by saying that are going to be cray-cray. It's taking you up a level. And the same thing with the war on terror. We forgot about these people who said, no, what we should do is criminalize them, not fight a war. We should hunt them down as international criminals. Because what do you do? What's the opposite side of this? If I say I'm in a war on terror, what does it do to the other side? Yeah, but it also actually, in a weird way, legitimates them, because then they're fighting the war, right? Before, they were criminals. Nobody likes criminals. Nobody likes terrorists either, but you can always say, oh, I'm fighting a war against the other people. So now let's get back to the central idea. What Mbembe is saying is that traditionally we have this idea of a legitimate war, right? We've just been given the definition, and that's the traditional definition. And what he's saying is that, yes, we traditionally have this legitimate war, but what he's talking about is the whole use of necropolitics to decide who should live and who should die is used as if it were war against certain populations. So you're exactly right that the war on terror and the war on drugs do have all the markers of necropolitics, right? They don't fit the definition of a legitimate war because they're not legitimate wars by any definition. They're just things that people want to believe are legitimate wars, so they call them that, correspond more to what he talks about as these ideas in which there's always these states of exception, where it's what we have to do now because they did this, we have to. And so warfare also, when you declare a war, then certain actions become legitimate, which would not have been legitimate if you didn't declare the war. So under usual circumstances, you're not supposed to kill other people. And even in a war, you're only supposed to kill the combatants, not the non-combatants, right? But under normal circumstances, when you don't just go over to New Zealand and shoot somebody, but under some circumstances, if there's a legitimate war, the soldiers can shoot each other. In fact, they're supposed to. Or you're looking at them like crazy. That's a legitimate war, right? Soldiers shooting each other, right? You're supposed to, bombing each other. But there are laws of war that people have developed. You're supposed to take out the military targets, not the civilians. You're supposed to limit the civilians. You're supposed to not torture people. But the thing is, if you call something like the war on terror, the war on drugs, it legitimates all kinds of things that would not have been legitimated if you don't use those words. You're absolutely right. That is his point, that we have this civilized definition of war, but then it gets used in all these other places to conduct extreme operations on either external enemies or internal enemies, where people get defined as the enemy. Now I get to do a police sweep. That actually is a good place to go into the Kristen Smith article, which is about death squads in Brazil and how they are often tied to the police. And so what she's looking at is how in Brazil, these death squads are in some ways performing these same activities and taking it out on people, having a war on people, internal enemies. The purpose of this article is to critically interrogate, specifically, this article ties death squad murders in Bahia, that's in Brazil, to the transnational exchange of torture practices between the United States and Latin America through foreign military and police training programs. It's weird, right? You wouldn't think it's a thing, but it is a thing. People cross-training and exchanging police and military practices across the Americas and elsewhere in the world. It's definitely a thing. So that's a thing. Yeah, so we have that. Then she says, so it's specifically about that. The epistemological, there you go, that's that word again. The epistemological production of the black body as the internal enemy in Brazil and the United States. Actually, that's interesting. I'll just mention that we learned in cultural anthropology and Latin America is that the place where by far the most enslaved Africans were taken to in the Americas was Brazil. Something like estimated 4 million people, as compared to the United States at probably 10 times, 8 to 10 times as many as would come to the United States. It's an enormous, enormous population. What she's saying is that in both places, though, you have this idea of black body as internal enemy. Epistemological production, that's a big word. The knowledge production, the idea of that. And the torture on, quote, terrorist Arab bodies in the war on terror. There it is, the 3 specifics. Wow, that was good. That's a good connection. That's exactly what happens. If you were at war, then all of a sudden you might become justified to do these things that you really shouldn't be doing. I contend that what links all of these is a transnational necropolitics based on the logics of white supremacy. So you have these things across the Americas and in the war on terror. What she's saying is that this is going across nations using Mbembe's necropolitics, who can live, who can die, on a logic of white supremacy that is not a state of exception, but the state of affairs. So the one thing that she is perhaps doing that's an extension, but a little bit different, Mbembe is drawing on some other people to say that the necropolitics of who should live and who should die often occurs in these states of exception. So you're like, okay, we need to take exceptional measures during war, or during an emergency. And what she is saying is that this is not exceptional. This is just the way it is. The way it is. So, for example, patterns of police violence demonstrate time and time again that the primary objective of the police's engagement with poor Black residents in peripheral neighborhoods is to kill first and ask questions later. Well, that seems true. It's hard to argue with that, at least in certain places. Yeah. So that sometimes death squads are not the counterpoint to just, and by just there, I think she means correct, or she doesn't mean just police, right? She means correct policing. They are the paradigm. Death squads are not the counterpoint to good policing. That's what they do. Kill first, ask questions later. What is Smith talking about here, by the way? What she's saying is that most of the time when you looked at police violence and death squad violence in Brazil, the pictures are of Black men. And the official count is usually the men. But what she's saying is there's a gendered aspect to this. When a poor woman comes out running and witnesses this scene, technically this woman is not dead, right? So they're not counted in the statistics on violence. But I mean, to have to see this, to go through it, to lose your son or your husband, it's going to have a health effect on you for the rest of your life, right? How do we factor this violence in to the necropolitics? Because it's not going to show up in the statistics. What it will show up in is on the display, the spectacle of it. Where has anybody ever displayed violence against other people? Does that happen? Where does that happen? Only in Brazil? Pretty much everywhere. But there's one particular place that was almost a pioneer of being happy, of selling postcards of people pointing at lynchings and stuff like that and being happy that they lynched people. Where was that? US. Yeah, we were way up on that one. So what she's saying is there's this whole spectacle and display that goes on. I found Kristen Smith where she is right now. Her email is to the University of Texas at Austin. That's where she's teaching. Well, she doesn't seem to have office hours for the whole year. Maybe she's on sabbatical. It'd be a good time to be on sabbatical if you were at Austin, because what's happening in Austin? University of Texas, Austin. I was trying to find this on the news in a way that I don't like how the news reports these things, but I'm interested in what you have to say about it. What's going on?
Yeah, I'm more scared of college students.
They talk about the violent clash. One side has, by their own admission, like 150 police and marching in line with their gear and on horseback. The other side has nothing. They're just students. I guess they didn't have permission for the protest, but they're on the fucking lawn of their own campus hanging out. Maybe they're protesting. I don't want to compare this too much to what happens in other countries, but we just heard about the kill first, ask questions later. To me, this looks like arrest them first, ask questions later. Arrest first, and then we'll talk about the First Amendment. And they're arresting people like little people, like just girls and old people, and just like, what were they even doing? It doesn't even, I don't understand what the reason for arresting people. If I had shown you the same pictures and I said this is a campus in El Salvador, and you saw that, what kind of a government, Amy, would you say was that represented? Yeah, these are the same kinds of images that I have been told is what happens under a totalitarian government, right? That's what you see. Protesters should be in jail. Like, why? Why should protesters be in jail?
Well, it did happen.
There are faculty colleagues and students at NYU who were arrested. Yeah. And in Columbia, the university, that's where everybody says this all started, but it was the beginning and has been the flashpoint center. This goes back to a long time ago in our class. Edward Said, the author of Orientalism, was a longtime professor at Columbia. And so
There are these roots of that idea. The process of disfigurement, dismemberment, torture, and assassination is in part what constructs the black body as the internal enemy. Now, again, I don't want to overly draw these parallels, but it does seem to be that the process of arrest, that thing construes people as protesters as being the internal enemy. We have to go get them before they get us.